Imagination. I've spoken about it quite a few times in my other shows, so I thought today I'd do imagination. I get caught up in imagination loads. And being a fiction writer, I used to use that as my excuse as well as going into my own little worlds. But imagination, what is it? Why do we have it? Gurdjieff says we shouldn't be using it. Though he does also say at one point we should use imagination for development at certain times and that it can aid us, but not just this frivolous imagination that we use most of the time in our world, in our lives. You know, we live in our inner world most of the time. Nobody really knows our inner world. No one knows what our imagination is or what you're imagining. You know, some people go off into their own little fantasy worlds in their imagination. Others have imagination about what how their real life could actually be better, like their everyday life, not their real genuine life, or developing the essence. You know, and others imagine, you know, coming and being rescued, where others imagine that they're going to be the rescuer. You know, there's so many ways of being using your imagination. You know, it distracts us a lot. Sometimes it's just better in our imaginary world than in our day-to-day life. But so I thought we'd do some imagination from the Gurdjieff work. I'm going to start with a quote from All and Everything. Consequences of the organ kunda buffer among those that form the subjectivity of the given being. Self-love, vanity, pride, swagger, imagination, bragging, arrogance. And I should really do something. Well, I think I have done one on the kunda buffer. Anyway, imagination is part of the kunda buffer when it was showing us the topsy-turvy world and giving us lots of pleasures and enjoyment. You know, and imagination was another way of distracting us from seeing the real world. I know imagination can be great in some places, like of art and, you know, fiction, as I was saying earlier. I like to think that my books were wonderfully imagined, though some of them seem inspired in some way. And I've said before in an interview, monkey mind, robot body definitely was downloaded to me, is a word that we use now. Though at the time when I wrote it, I wouldn't have used that word maybe. It just appeared in my head. So we're going on with self-imagination. Self-imagination, self-calming, impulses which have become inseparable from ordinary man. So we get caught up in our self-imagination of who we are. We imagine that we're this kind of person. We're not seeing ourselves for what we really are. We like to pick ourselves up, or we might put ourselves down. Either way, the way we look at ourselves or we imagine ourselves to be to others isn't necessarily what we really are or how we come across to other people. You know, we like to think that we're, you know, some people like to think that they're, maybe I'm doing it about myself, I don't know. You know, I'm some wise, courageous person that goes forth in the world, but is that my imagination of how I want to be, not who I really am? And that's what we have to look at when we're looking at our self-imagination. What are you seeing yourself as, and is it true? Can you look at yourself without imagination, but with your real centers all harmonized with what you really are, the real self-observation? And it can be harmful to yourself because it's a bit of a wake-up call of, oh, I'm not the person I want to be. And this is why some people, I think, leave the work or leave this kind of esoteric training because they don't like having to face what they've really been like in the past or who they really have been acting as. Because it is all an act. We're not being the real ourselves. We're not being the people we imagine ourselves to be. And that can be quite harmful, quite hurtful. But if we take that on board and see that, we can change rather than sit there going, what an idiot I am, or what a fool I am, or, you know, what can people think of me? Not important. It's how you can develop yourself. Maybe that self-imaginative person you saw of yourself, if you think that's a good person, you can work towards being that and actually be it. Or maybe that is your essence coming through, trying to say, this is who you should be. But as it says here about the kunda buffer, gives you self-love, vanity, pride. arrogance, bragging. Sometimes that's what our self-imagination can lead to, because we start thinking we're someone that we're not, because we're imagining ourselves as being something else, and then beginning to believe that imagination. Oh, I'm like this, I'm like that. We're not really. So this is from In Search of the Miraculous. Moving center working for thinking center produces, for example, mechanical reading or mechanical listening, as when a man reads or listens to nothing but words and is utterly unconscious of what he is reading or hearing. This generally happens when attention, that is, the direction of the thinking center's activity, is occupied with something else. A moving center is trying to replace the absent thinking center, because we don't think when we should think, and we don't often feel when we should feel. Sometimes we think for feeling or mistake that. We mistake feeling for thinking, or feel something when we should be thinking about it. It's all a bit confusing, but once you start self-observing yourself and realizing this, you start paying attention as to when you should be thinking about something and when you should be feeling about something and which should be doing what. So we're talking about trying to replace the absent thinking center. This very easily becomes a habit because the thinking center is generally distracted not by useful work, thought, or contemplation, but simply by daydreaming or by imagination. Imagination is one of the principal sources of the wrong work of centers. Each center has its own form of imagination and daydreaming, but as a rule, both the moving and the emotional centers make use of the thinking center, which very readily places itself at their disposal for this purpose, because daydreaming corresponds to its own inclinations. Observation of the activity of imagination and daydreaming forms a very important part of self-study. So when you catch yourself daydreaming, living in imagination, you're going to try and perhaps stop it and wonder, why am I thinking this? And analyze, should we be analyzing? But why are you in that imaginative state, instead of working and looking at things in what's really happening in the real state, in the real way of thinking, seeing, feeling, moving? And it carries on in Search of the Miraculous. Personality feeds on imagination and falsehood, where essence would work on genuine feeling, genuine thought, genuine actions. So the imagination is distracting us from finding our essence. Now he talks about Kundalini, Ouspensky. Kundalini is the power of imagination, the power of fantasy, which takes the place of a real function. Maybe I should have got the whole of that book paragraph out for that, because I know many people are looking to ignite their Kundalini and set it off up their spine. Some Gurdjieffians say it's the same as Kundabata. Some say it isn't, and I find it all a bit confusing. What is the Kundalini? I looked into it many years ago, when I was looking at the Eastern traditions. The Kundalini is a special energy that helps to awaken, goes from the bottom of your spine, where our tails would be if we had them, which is where Gurdjieff says they put the Kundabata, goes up the spine, up, and once it's ignited, then comes out through the forehead, which is why you might see in some of the Egyptian statues or the pharaohs, they have the snake and the eagle coming out of their forehead. That's the third eye opening up, which is what the Kundalini is supposed to help do. But it's also a very fiery energy, the Kundalini, and can be, if not done correctly, send you mad. Again, I'm not an expert. Perhaps go and speak to someone that studies Kundalini, or an esoteric teacher that deals with that. Yoga teachers could be spoken to. It's finding one that understands the esoteric side of it, and not just that, oh, yoga will make you better in your... So yoga is good. I'm not ridiculing yoga. Yoga, Qigong, Tai Chi, all that is good for you. But it's finding a proper esoteric teacher that understands the energies that it's opening up. It can be hard. Not all of them do it. So this is, again, Ouspensky. He realizes that imagination is a destructive faculty, that he can never control it, and that it always carries him away from his more conscious decisions in a direction in which he had no intention of going, which is true. You get caught up in an imaginative streak and you just ride along with it. You know, I remember reading Jung saying about how he follows the imaginative visions that come to him, and he got stuck in one for a whole day once. And I find myself sometimes caught up in an imaginative streak that goes on for ages. Even though I'm still going about my business, I'm still caught up in it. So it is like a deceiver, like it comes to trick us away from what's really going on. So imagination is almost as bad as lying. It is, in fact, lying to oneself. Man starts to imagine something in order to please himself, and very soon he begins to believe what he imagines, or at least some of it. And that's like what I was saying at the beginning. We imagine ourselves what we're going to be, who we are, and we believe it, but we're not like that. We might start out as trying to say, I wish I was like that. But after a while, we begin to believe it and deceive ourselves and think I'm this kind of person when we're not at all. We don't come across, we might be inside, but we don't come across as that when we're out with other people. And then not just as using an example of children. Children are discouraged from guessing and using controlled imagination. It is dubbed telling lies, one of the results being that children learn to lie like adults. So, you know, we're being taught as children not, you know, as kids, we love our imagination, don't we? We play with our imaginary friends and play our imaginary games. And then I suppose we need to be weaned out of that and start looking at the real world and acting in reality. But some people aren't brought out of that, children aren't brought out of that, and they carry on living in that imaginary world, and then they're still, because it's a world full of lies, they think they can carry it on into their adult life. And it doesn't matter if we tell lies or do lies or say lies, and it does, because it affects us and those around us. But also, as a child, it is a great way to stretch the mind, I suppose, is one way of saying it. But do we still need to do that when we're adults? Why do we still live in imaginary worlds? And I think it's because we know that we're not happy in this everyday life that we're living, because we're not developing ourselves. Instead, we're just asleep and going along day by day, following the rat race and everything else, and caught up in the everyday life of everybody else, instead of living harmoniously with the planet and the universe. We're living, as Gurdjieff says, in the lunatic asylum of this planet, because it is all run illogically. We don't look after each other. We're not looking after ourselves or each other or the planet. And, you know, there just shouldn't be all this negativity going on all the time, the hatred, the despair, the dislike of people, the racism. If we were all living harmoniously, that wouldn't be happening. So Gurdjieff also says a lot of it's astrologically based and is influenced by the stars. But if we were more living in a more harmonious world, then them kind of things, when they happen from the astral world, wouldn't affect us so much, because we'd be more aware of what's coming and what's happening, and would use it in a different way that would be more useful to our development and to our carrying on living in a harmonious world, which we're not living in a harmonious world. But he does say about imagination can be useful, and this is later on, really, for when you've started working out how to use the work for yourself, how to self-develop using self-observation, self-remembrance, you know, as I've said before, about common sense and things like that. Because imagination can be good for imagining yourself, developing yourself and that higher version of yourself, of how, not necessarily how you know it's going to be, because we don't know until we succeed up to that way, but imagine ourselves doing it. I think it's kind of like the practice what you want to do, you know, fake it till you make it kind of attitude. But you can also imagine yourself perhaps, I don't know, talking with the gods, walking with the gods, talking with the saints, walking with the saints, You know, you've got to use imagination when you're doing your meditations and prayers quite a bit, though some people would disagree with that and say we should just be looking at nothing. But then what's wrong with imagining perhaps yourself getting in touch with the Christ consciousness, or Muhammad, or Buddha, or any of the saints, you know, to perhaps get some kind of teaching from them. Maybe that imagination of visualizing being with them would become a reality in a way, which would be better than the imagination of yourself in a fantasy world, you know, living out your, let's take, for example, you want to be James Bond, you know, and you're imagining yourself being some secret agent that goes and saves the world. All well and good for those that don't want to develop. It's just a waste of imagination. But if you can instead use that imagination in some way to be a more attuned, awakened person, fake it till you make it kind of attitude, then that imagination might start becoming real. I don't know. This is all just speculation on my part of what I've been learning from the esoteric teachings. Imagination is a great deceiver. I do find that I get distracted very easily. I think I'm doing something, and then suddenly, you know, a few minutes later, I'm like, how did that daydream come about? They sneak up on you and just come in from nowhere. So I often wonder if the devil puts them in our heads to distract us from doing good, right work. Don't know. Maybe even imagine yourself walking with Mr. Gurdjieff. That's a good one to try. Maybe he'll end up coming and visiting you, or any of the great teachers. So, imagination. Do we want to live in an imaginary world, or do we want to live in the real world? Till next time, adios.